So let's see, do we have anybody who has not arrived? I was thinking otherwise we could start going through a little bit of the home assignments while the last installation is going on. Let's do that. And so the two home assignments, you have received this also in detail via email yesterday. Did somebody not receive the email? Or somebody has not checked? No? Everybody receives it. Good. So then the parts in this home assignment are, I've tried to design them in a way that they can be useful for you, so you get this as a first test of how to use the software, but it's not meant to be something for me. It's do it for yourself. That's the key thing. And the idea was for you to think about a key question or a key mechanism in your research that is normally something you have to describe. Something that is fundamental and you build research hypothesis from. Because it's useful to start thinking about building templates. So sometimes you want a template of a cell or a hematopoietic lineage differentiation or something that you can build on and put in new things to. Because the more of these useful templates you build for your own illustrations, the more illustrations you can make easily. So you can just take all of these fragments, and because these are all objects that you can move around and scale, everything can be reused. And that's what all artists they do when they do their illustrations, is to reuse and reuse and reuse. So when you see review articles in Nature, so you can spot things that they reuse. They have one classical neuron or a synapse, and then they just copy-paste it, change some colors, change some size, and then there's a completely new drawing. So this is good for you to start doing yourself as well, to build your own style. And this is the picture I thought could be useful to get rolling with that. So pick one thing that is central and you would like to use for a review article or a poster or a PowerPoint presentation, something like that. And it's meant to be produced entirely in Illustrator. So you want this to be useful in the near future. You want this to actually have a purpose for yourself. So that is key when you pick this. And you need to produce it from scratch. You shouldn't take something that somebody else has drawn and modify it. You want to feel that you have generated this all through from the start. And as I said, it should be Illustrator, and this one has to be fully with vector graphics. So you cannot mix in photos and Photoshop parts in this. This forces you to find the limitations of vector graphics and see what you can do and what you can't do. And you'll be surprised how many things you actually can do with all of the lines and effects in there. And then this one should be submitted as an Illustrator file. And the second one is then supposed to look a little bit of this mixture that we discussed yesterday, of mixing vectors, mixing with photographs, mixing with text, and to make that into one composite figure. And this is then becoming a little bit more artificial, but my vision of that one would be that you can have it as one of the panels in a poster. So there should be some title and then a figure of your own research results. And that can be mixed, that should be mixed with some photos and some vector-based information, whatever that can be. And in some cases you may not have something right at hand, but at least you can fake this part a little bit, generate the graph or export something from your flow cytometer or something else where you push to find the vector graphics in this. And just bring that together in one panel. And then the best thing is if it includes your real data. So you really try it on the type of data that you generate yourself. So if you do a lot of confocal microscopy, use that. If you do flow cytometry, use those type of data. If you are mainly electrophysiologists, use the recordings and things like that to really see where the software you use has the limitations of exporting in the vector format, if they can or if they cannot. And then it really should have this mix, so you are forced to use InDesign. And that's the whole thing here. You want to have to use InDesign for the final parts. but you may need to use Illustrator for many of the things for cleaning up illustrations. And that's something we're going to go through together today, how to bring things in from different software. And you will realize that a lot of software can export vector graphics, but in a quite a dirty way. So we need to learn how to clean this up efficiently and understand why they export it in the way that they do. And all of that, you should try to fit the title and text together with the panels. And this is what Ludwig will talk about today as well. So this is to bringing in his competence into this home assignment as well. And then to not sort of flood the email system, it would be nice if you can actually upload them to this link here. And this link is a small but very useful software that is, see if I have web access. Yeah, it just looks like this on your computer. So then the password you got in the email is SciGraph2013, and you have that in the email as well. And when you have logged in, you just get this one that you can choose which file you want to upload, and then it uploads it to me and I get it directly into my Dropbox. So that helps me to get all the files in an easy way. And so,
sorry,
yeah.
The final file format.
Yes.
What should that be?
Yeah, so good question. The Illustrator file should be in a .ai file. And the InDesign one should be in a PDF file. So you learn how to create a PDF out of your InDesign, and that's what you should send in. And the reason why I don't want you to send in an InDesign file is that InDesign files are containers with links to a lot of other files. So it's not always easy to bring with you the InDesign file with all the files needed for it. So it's easier if you create this PDF file and submit it to me. And it's also useful to learn how to do it. There is a way to take all of these files that belong to an InDesign file and put it in one folder. And that's useful if you have collaborators that you want to send the originals to, and for them to be able to work on this. And that's another thing I'll show you as well. But there are detailed information about this in the email as well. A little bit on how you can name the files so I can find them and so forth. So are these assignments clear? Do you think that they are feasible? And then, of course, the ambition for you should be that you feel that you have got started with the software. It doesn't mean that this has to be the final image that you should be able to submit to the journal. If one part is incomplete, that's perfectly fine. Just work on it as much you feel you have to or want to, and then submit it at the end of that time on Sunday. So we need it on Sunday afternoon at 5, because for the other two people also to have a chance to look at all the submissions. And then we'll go through the submissions on Tuesday. And it's normally quite a fun thing to see all of these, and you see how differently people choose to represent and describe things. And it gives you a lot of good input, how you can make your own illustrations. So do we have people still installing, or is everything still installing? Updating. Okay, but updates are fine. But
One question, I don't know if you will cover that, but I think an interesting thing to discuss would be the problem of we have to see illustrations that are adaptive.
yes.
How does that? I don't know about the copyright situation. I mean, I just assume. Yeah, what's the limit between adapting and actually taking and just modifying, or
I think that there are copyright laws that are very strict. If you would want to go along the route of being clearly copyright, then adapting is clearly not at all approved. You wouldn't be able to do that. But then if you think about from the art side, there has been a lot of adaptations. If you take Andy Warhol and others, they're of course adapting a lot of things. So there's the question of copyright, and then there's the question of what people do. And for me, if there is a non-commercial situation where I present data or give lectures, adapting illustrations is something that has to be accepted. As long as we, as it is in this case, you acknowledge where it comes from and how it's adapted. That part I would see would be okay. The big question is, can you adapt something and then publish again? And that I would, yeah.
Blah, 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 blah.
And then sometimes you do it when you have original data and then you make a review article. And then you adapt. But then there has to be approval from the original publisher. So there's often then said with permission from the original publisher. So then you're getting approval for the copyright and how it's adapted. So I would never do it myself in a review article without getting the original permission. But it's a very useful thing. It's actually one of the things that we'll go through is how to bring in illustrations from PDF files and modify them and clean them up for your own PowerPoint presentations. And that I find very useful for journal clubs, for teaching, for just general communication of science. And it's also sometimes, of course, that you have your own data, but you, if you have it published in a nice journal, they redraw your illustrations sometimes to fit in their profile. And then you want to use those files yourself. And you may not get the original. So then you have to take them out of the PDF file as well. So then they are still, in principle, your files, but they have the copyright for them. But it's a great question. I think we see that more and more. And of course, number one is to always acknowledge where data comes from. It's never correct to adapt and never acknowledge who it came from. And then the other part is the copyright. But at the university, they are now negotiating a new copyright deal for using figures and illustrations and photos in teaching. So we'll see that coming 1st of January, how that will be. So it will be a bit more flexible than it is today, because today it's quite draconian actually. We're not allowed to even submit handouts to students. We do, but on printed it is slightly illegal if there's something called that. And then submitting it digitally we just cannot do. So, but that will change on 1st of January. So we still have some people installing. But we may be able to do a soft start on some of the things that you may want to adapt when you have installed this. And the first tip is actually a Mac-only tip. And it has to do with Acrobat. So with the Creative Suite you got installed now, you got Acrobat 10 Professional installed as well. And the difference between the Acrobat Professional and Reader is the ability to edit document. So in Acrobat Professional you can install a PDF printer where you can generate PDFs from anywhere. And that's useful especially on Windows. On the Mac side you can do that all the time anyway, but in Windows this helps you a lot. But it also comes with a plugin for your web browsers. And this plugin I find myself to be a very slow plugin. And it is overriding the original plugin for PDFs on the Mac and is making the PDF viewing much slower. So the first tip I would say to the Mac people is to uninstall that plugin. And to do that, there are a couple of commands. So you can just follow along on this, that you need to go into the Finder and then you need to say go and go to folder. And then the folder you should have is /library and then say go. And in the library you have one that's called Internet Plugins. And in this Internet Plugins you have two files that are called Acrobat. And of course I don't have them on my computer, so I can't show you those files there. But they are called, does anybody have them open? You can say what they are called. PDF, Acrobat PDF, Adobe PDF, yeah. So those files, you can just throw them away. You actually don't need them. And the only thing they do is to override the PDF viewing on the internal system.
So which one shall we get rid of?
Both the Adobe PDF. So the next tips are in Illustrator. And in Illustrator, it has to do with the color profiling of files. So you may have seen in Illustrator when you work around with it, when you make a new file, it asks you what color mode to use here. And the default is CMYK. As we talked about yesterday, this is the color space for printing. And that is the default. And there's another thing that is default in the software, and it's the color matching. So what Adobe tries to do is to have colors to try to match between their own software and printing presses. But because you will in 99.9% of the time not use printing presses. You will use your own copiers or present on screens like this. There is an issue with having the color handling the way that Adobe suggests. And I'll try to say why that is. So I'll just this check that it's by default. Yeah. So if I open a first file here, see if I can make this edit a bit clear. So you see this file. And in this case, you see these 4 circles. 3 of them look the same. The 4th does not look the same. And what they are the color black described in 4 ways. And so the first one here is then, let me just close these lights because it may be. So the first one is 100% gray in a black and white grayscale. So if you look at the color in this palette here, let me just see it there. So in this palette, you can choose to have grayscale. And then the only colors you pick from is from 0 to 100% black. And then you can choose to have RGB, there's another one called HSB, and then you have CMYK. So the second one here is called 0 in RGB color. So if you look at that from the RGB color, it has 0 in all the 3 colors. And this is, and then we have in the CMYK one, this is 100% black in the CMYK. But it does not have any of the other colors of cyan, magenta, and yellow. And so you can actually, in principle, make this circle more black than it is there. And then the last one is only the other 3 colors. And in this case, it looks okay here. It looks fine in Illustrator that 3 of them are black and the other one is grayish. But actually, you want all of these 4 to be black, all of them. And the reason why you want this to be black is if you look in another software that doesn't do the color correction as Illustrator does, and you're trying to bring up the same one. Let's see how that looks on the screen. So this is how it looks in the first version. You see that they are actually not 100% black. They are not the same black. So this is the blackest of the black. And these are lighter black, and this is the lightest black. So you can adjust this through 2 means. So the first thing you want to do is to go in the edit in Illustrator, and you go to color settings. So these color settings, you see there that it says North America General Purpose 2, and this is for printing presses, how they use their printing press. And you want this to emulate Illustrator 6. And this is the old version of Illustrator where they did not have this color correction built in for printing presses. So when you do that, and then say OK, you see that the one that is CMY now has also become black, as it should be in this color space. So now all of them look the same in the Illustrator. So that's perfectly OK. But if you export this file in Keynote, what that file would look is like this. So it doesn't actually correct everything. It makes the RGB one lighter. So these three are the same, but this is not the same as those guys. So the second thing you want to do is to make sure that you work in the RGB color space instead. So now you see here that it says CMYK up here. So you can do this in two ways. One is that you can change the current document, and that's going to document color mode in file and go to RGB. But the other thing you can do is when you take new documents, you can change the color mode in there. So this is what I do. I always work in RGB in the color mode here. So you just set that, and then it will be the default for all your new documents.
Is this also if you're actually intending to actually print your document? You would still use this, or?
I would do that because the printers have their own algorithms to convert from RGB to CMYK for that specific printer. So it gives the better color for that printer. It can optimize the CMYK for its own profile rather than taking the generic CMYK, which is the lowest common denominator of all color printers. So you can use the bigger color space and then bring it back to that CMYK. So in my experience, it actually gives you the better quality even when you print. So when you do that and say that your documents should start with RGB, the same for files or circles look like this in Keynote. So this is what you want when you present them in other presentation software, that all give the same black. And you see that they are much, I guess the RGB is the same as the first version up there. But so then this is much more predictable. And so it helps you to not have these washed out blacks from your files that you have generated in Illustrator. So there are two things, the emulate Illustrator 6 colors and working in RGB. This will help you there. So the default one is when you create a new document. So that's where you have this. It says advanced. It may have been hidden like this. So you may need to click that. Was that clear? Good. Somebody still has issues installing, or it's gone well? It's still, it's just... Yeah, exactly. So when you switch a document that is in CMYK, it will change the colors to adjust to RGB, but it may not be perfectly exact. So it's the safer bet to start in RGB than changing afterwards. But if you have documents you have created already, you can switch this to RGB afterwards. So that was on the color side. So next, I thought we can have some examples that you can all try. And one example that is quite illustrative in one way is trying to make a pseudo 3D cylinder. So you can try to make this yourself just by making a rectangle, and then below that rectangle you want to make a perfect circle starting from the center at this bottom. And as you remember, you press the Option key to start moving out from the center of the circle, and then Shift to make it perfectly circular. But here in this case, because you want to make it pseudo 3D, you don't want it to be a perfect circle, but you want it to match the width of this other one.
Can I ask you this also?
Yeah. So just to clarify to everybody, how you switch between the rectangle and the other ones is just to keep pressed on the tool. So you see all the tools with a small white triangle in the bottom have multiple tools at that bottom. So then you keep pressed and then you can switch these. So once you have done this one, you can then learn how to make a copy. And to make a copy and move it along the same line, you press the Option key, and you see that the arrow then turns into a double arrow, meaning that anything I touch now will become a duplicated version. So then you click and drag this up, and while I'm dragging, if I press this Shift key, you see that it now moves along only one axis, straight like this. Or it can go out 45 degrees or 90 degrees this way. So Shift helps you to align things quickly. So you make two copies like this. So the Option key, you press the Option key and then you click and drag. So you can then move this up to the top.
Which one?
It's called Alt for Option. It is this. So the Swedish is called Alternativ.
Yeah.
This one.
So now this, you are part way for creating your cylinder. Did everybody get this far? No. Success. Yes. Everybody done? No? Okay. So next thing you want to do is start looking at the perspective of this cylinder. So now it has a skewed perspective in the way that you see both top and bottom. So we're going to fake this one to be looking slightly from the top. So what you need to do then is to hide the part that goes like this one. And do you have any guess how you would do that the easiest? You can of course move this one to the back of the other one. If we go to arrange send to back, you get it like this. But that's not what you want. So what you can do is to mark this one and that one. And then we use our pathfinder. So in the pathfinder, you then go to the one called Unite.
Where did you have pathfinder?
Yes. So it's in Window, and you have something called Pathfinder. Yeah, that's a good point. I should reset this. So Window, Pathfinder, and then you go to the Unite button. So then you see that you got the outline of these two together. Did you all manage with that? Yeah, good. So now it is one of those things that in many cases may be good enough. That you have something that has the right look of this cylinder. But there are cases where, because you have now, when you move this lid, you see, when you move this lid up, you see that you have this line below. And what this means is that if you would change the transparency of this lid to go down to 50%, you then see the line below. So when you want to do something transparent, this is not the nice combination. So I'm going to learn you one more strategy that is very useful. So if you mark the top oval here, and you copy this with the copy command, and you paste. When you paste it, it always pastes in the center of your viewing area. And this is not something that you often want. So what you can do instead is that when you have copied, so you copy, you can say paste in front. And paste in front means that it will paste it directly on top of where it is right now. So when I paste that in, you see that you have now generated two copies that are on top of each other. You don't see it, but they are perfectly overlapped. So if I take one of them and move, you see that you have one below. And why did I do this? Well, because if you have those two shapes together, you can actually start using the pathfinder for one more thing. So what I can do now is to select all these three objects that are here. So this lower one and the two circles. And how do I do that? Well, in Illustrator, and this is different in many software, in Illustrator you can drag from one side out here, keep the mouse button pressed and drag a square, and then it selects everything that has any part inside that box. So you don't need to mark the whole object, you just need to mark a part of that object. And then we have selected all of the three of those. So what you then want to do is to unselect the top object. And how do I unselect one object without selecting all three? And that you do with the Shift key. So when you keep the Shift key pressed and click on the top oval here, you have now selected only the two bottom and unselected the top one. So if I move this out, you see that you leave the top lid at the same place. And I'll undo that. So why do I do that? It's because I want this lid to be in the exact same place, but I want to have the other two so that I can use my pathfinder minus front. So when I have unselected the top lid, I can now take minus front. And what have I done then? Now I have created a shape that looks like this. So now you have a cylinder that is only the two objects that you see. And now you can make the cylinder transparent or do whatever you want with it. Did you all manage to do that? Good. Excellent. So these are some basic tools you use. And the next tool is to understand how to work with grouped things. Because these are now two objects that, of course, we can choose to, let's see, we can color this to give it some 3D appearance. But you want to keep these two things together. So grouping is a very useful thing. And grouping you do by selecting all the parts. And then you can say, let's see, in object, you go to group. And when you have grouped them, they move together. So when you just click on one, you can move it all. And if I scale it, you scale it all together. So you can manage that as if it was a single object. But then that single object, there may be still things that you want to edit inside it. So say that I want to change the color on this. You can mark it and then you double click. And when you double clicked on this, you see up in the left corner here that you are now, that was a bit too big, that you are inside this group. And now you can actually, in that group, edit things one by one. So I can now take the lid and I can move it up. So. And when I'm done with it, I double click outside. And now I'm outside the group, but the group still is retained. So they still move together. So you can keep them as a group and just double click into it and then edit parts. And then you double click outside and you can go back as keeping this as one group.
So how did you group from the beginning?
So the grouping is done in the object. So let me go in object, you can ungroup, and then they are back as two separate ones. And then so you just select both of them through dragging from the side like this, and then object group. Was that clear? Good. So, and then just to remind you from yesterday that in my case here, when I scale this one up and down, you see that the line thickness does not change. So that is kept the same. And this is because in the transform, I do not have the scale, stroke, and effects checked. But if you check that, you can play around with that yourself to see that if I now scale this up, it makes my lines very thick. And to change the line thickness, you have this palette over here that's called stroke. And in that one, you can then specify the thickness yourself, exactly what thickness you want. And this is useful because sometimes when you have taken in a lot of different documents, they will all have slightly different line thickness. So this is where you want to play around with that. This palette has much more use than you would see from the start. And this is the thing with Illustrator, that it keeps some tools away from you until it knows that you need it. And where you want to see this is show options. So when you go to options, you see that this palette is actually much more complicated than just making the width. And what you want to see there is a couple of things that are useful for us. So if we make a box next to this, or we can actually make that box covering. So we can make a box which has a transparent inner and this line. So the first thing you need to know here is how color works in Illustrator. And Illustrator actually has 4 properties of color. You have the color of the stroke and you have the color of the filling. And that's of course the most straightforward ones. But then you also have the color of a type and the color of the stroke of the type. So when you have made a text, and you select this text, you actually have the same thing being for that typeset. So then you can change the color of the type and the color of the stroke. These colors can be switched, and you have down here. So you have swap the fill and stroke color. And next to that you see you have this called Shift X. And why there's Shift X and why there are lettering is that all of these are short commands. So, and you see that with the zoom tool here, and you see, for example, with the original selection tool is V. So some of these are quite useful to learn so that you can quickly yourself go back. So if I'm in this type editing mode, if I just press, not in the case of type, because then I write in it, but otherwise you press V and you go back to the pointer, and then I can move this. So that works in every place except where I showed it, when you're actually inside writing in a text box. Of course, you need to be able to write V. But otherwise, outside, you can do that. And then when you have selected this box 1, and I had a Shift X, I can then switch my stroke color and the fill color. This is a bit too small to see this well, but if I move this up like this and make the stroke, so you now see that this text has a black stroke and a transparent filling. And then if I take Shift X again, I move it back to have transparent stroke and the black filling. So what I've done next to this below is that I have created this box that has a black line. And the reason why I did that was to go back to this stroke palette that you have over here. So if we take this stroke palette, and I'll just drag it out like this, so we can have it next to the box, you can now make this box a dashed line. So to make a dashed line, you click this checkbox there, and you get dashed line. So when I unselect it, you see that you have now dashed lines. And the spacing here is set by the dash and gap. So if you only have one specified here, like in the original case, you have 12 points of dash. So these are 12 points, and then there's a gap that is 12 points, and then the dash again. But you don't have to have that symmetrical. You can then have the dash being 12, but the gap being 6 points, if you had it selected, 6 points. So then you have one that has smaller gaps than the dashes. And then you can make another dash being 2 points, another gap being 6 points. Again, I should have selected that, 2 points. And 6. And then you have made a more of a elaborate dashing around this. So this, you can see Illustrator has a nice feature, and it is that it's trying to adjust it so that the dashes start and finish at the end of the corners. And that will mean that your gaps will not be perfectly exactly the same. So when I move this out slightly, like so, it still retains this in the edge. And in many cases that looks nice from a dashing, but you have the option to not have that. So then you press this button there, and then the dashes and gaps will be exactly the correct ones. So then you see that they start differently, end differently here. But normally the other version to adjust it inside is what is looking nice. There's another thing in here that you start to appreciate when you work with very thick lines. So if I now make another line next to this here, and I choose not to have that one dashed and make this thick, like so. So when you see this line, you see that there are two properties in here that you may or may not want. One is that you have a perfectly flat end of this, and that's the default version. But in some cases you may want to have a soft end, and then you choose to have this round cap, and then you make this a soft end stroke. The other thing that you have in the original is that the point you specify is the outermost end of the stroke. And this is sometimes very good, but if you think about putting this stroke into a square, you may actually want the stroke to continue out equal amount of on all sides. And that you can do with the last cap. So then it is the same square top, but it is just extending it out the same amount as the thickness of the stroke. So if I make the strokes thinner, this cap also reduces in size. So these things are useful in the stroke dialog. And there's one more thing in here that I use. So if you go down to make, we call this 4 in width, you can now choose to make arrowheads. So down below the dashed line you have your arrowheads, how they will start and how they will finish. So then you can choose one arrowhead to be in the top, and you can choose another arrowhead to be in the bottom. They don't have to be the same, so you can have one that is the start of the arrow and one that is, of course, the end of the arrow. So, and you have all of these different versions, some more useful than the others. So you can make an arrow that looks like this. So that's also hidden in this stroke dialog. And here, of course, you also see that the scale of this arrowhead is directly proportionate to the width of the stroke. So if I make the stroke thicker, the arrowhead will be much larger. But you may not want that, and then you can go in and actually scale this down. So you can scale down the head to make that smaller, and then also the other one. And you can scale it to the size you want. And then you have there also this that you can align, either that you extend the tip outside the stroke, or the end of the tip of the arrow is at the top of the stroke. And that you do with these buttons below. So if I choose the other one here, it extends outside. And that may not be as good if you have used exact lengths, but it's good to know that it exists there.
Is there a way of actually narrowing the arrow tip? Because when you scale, it usually scales this way, like this.
No.
I find them quite wide.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, because usually I just make mine, I draw a triangle and then convert it.
Yes. So there are two ways. You can either draw it yourself, or you can, at the end, you can choose to take this arrow, and then you can go to, let's see where it is now, expand appearance, and what you then make it into the shape, and then you can fine tune it afterwards. But you cannot do it directly in itself. So now I think we have coffee outside. Okay. So did you all manage to generate this figure? Almost? Yeah. Very good. So this was a small introduction to the basic functions of Illustrator. And the next step, I thought we can now start to discuss how do we actually get started with something more complex. So when we want to draw a system of things hanging together, it isn't that easy to just start using the free-form tools to illustrate something. And so one tip I would have is that you start with something you know how to do, and that's to sketch on paper. Because sketching gives you the opportunity to make some rough layout of where things should go, in internal scales and other things. And that can really help you to also learn where to put your points in the Bezier curves. And to do that, I can start to show you, let me just see here. So, in this part, I thought I'll show you how I get started with something. So in this case, the scenario is like this. I had to draw a system of neuronal connections for a grant application. So it needed to be something done rather quickly, not focusing on super much of details. And where I started with that was to start drawing something. And the drawing I made was very crude, something like this. And so this was just pen on paper and trying to make a simple outline of where things should connect to where. To try to think of where can I put this cell, which is a cholinergic interneuron, to this medium spiny neuron, and how they should connect to each other. And this I then use the scanner we have, the copier machine. You can just scan to email. And so you scan it as black and white. And when you have a file like this that then drops into your email folder, you can then go into Illustrator. So I create a new file, and we can then say that in this case we'll use a A4 lying down in the size. So you can see the orientation here is upright or a landscape. So an A4 page. And then with that, you can use the place command in the file. So let me see. I wonder, does everybody have web access? Because you could actually get this file directly. I will copy it into the shared Dropbox folder here. So if you want to trace along, you can now find that file in the Dropbox as well. It should be there within a couple of seconds. So what I will do is to go in, sorry, that one, and I place this file. Sorry.
Have you been invited to that Dropbox?
Yeah, you have the direct link in the first email. Yes, that should be a short Google. It's actually surprisingly slow to go up there. Ah, there is. Wondering if they have capacity issues now when everybody's on the Wi-Fi, but see if I can find the link for you.
I think internet is now a bit too slow.
It may be actually that it may. You can actually, I think, trace along without this file, and it will turn up with time. So what I do is then to place this file within Illustrator. And you see that it is placed with a crossover like this. And what does this actually mean? It means that this file is not inside Illustrator. So when you save the file, this is not saved in it. It's just a link, a reference to that file. And why is it a reference and not inside? And it has to do with the way I placed it. So if I redo the place command and I select the image, you see that I have now the button checked link. So if I take away the link and place it, it now doesn't have the cross over it. And that means that this image is now saved inside that Illustrator file. We'll move along with it. But so there are pros and cons with that. The good thing is that you know that it will always be inside. The negative thing is that you cannot change that file and get it updated inside Illustrator. So this will be there all the time. And for PDF files and illustrations, it can have many other things happening to it if you link or not. So we'll get back to that later on as well.
Is that functionally the same as embedding?
This is exactly the same as embedding. Yeah. So it is in there that time.
I guess then the size of our file is smaller.
It's much smaller, yeah, exactly. So it just keeps a small reference with a preview inside it. So if you can manage with links, and especially in this case where it's such a temporary thing, you have it in for the start, and then after a while you want to get rid of this. So now I want to trace over this file, but as you see now, this file takes up the whole page. So if I try to drag something here, of course I drag this image. So the next thing you want to do is to go into the layers palette. And that has the symbol here called layers, and it has two sheets on top of each other. But you can also find it in the window command, that you go to layers. And in this layer, you see now that there's a single layer. And here are a couple of things you need to understand. So you have the eye is toggling visibility of this layer. So if I take away the eye there, you don't see that layer anymore. You see it's hidden. Next to it here, you have a lock. So when you click that, you lock this layer. It means that I cannot move anything, I cannot delete anything on that layer. It is locked. which in this case is good. So you can see I cannot draw on this now. It has this symbol that says that it's prohibited to draw in there. So then the next thing you have is that you can rename this layer. So with the layer 1 here, you can rename. And next to that, you have a small preview. And, oops, sorry. Yes. So when I double click this preview, you get up this layer option dialog. And this layer option dialog I brought up because it has a feature called dim images 2. And so this is what you want to check then. So you want to say that I want to dim this image, and in this case I think maybe 40% will be enough, and I say OK. So you see that this become a little bit dim, so it is just like a tracing paper you put on there. And then you can go back here. So now I've created a locked layer, because the lock is in here, that is dimmed, and I can still see it, but I can easily now toggle that on and off. So that's perfect for tracing. And then I generate a new layer where you can then select the color here. And what does this color mean? It means the color of the selection that you get, the anchors and the lines, so you can see which layer the object you're moving belongs to. And so you can color code that. So the light red may be fine for this. And then we say OK. So this second layer will actually now be the layer that I draw in. So let's start now. Let me get rid of these here. And so I thought we could start with this simple shape of the cholinergic interneuron here. And how would I trace this one? So you have two options. You have the total freehand pen. And this is a tool that I would urge you to not use. And it is, so when you see this pen, and you can drag along like this and try, especially with a touchpad, it's not very easy to trace. And you see that what I get out there is a not very nice looking, let's see, line. It's very jagged, and you have a lot of these anchor points all along that. And why is it a bad thing to have all of these anchor points? There are two things that make it complicated with the many anchors. One is to get soft and simple shapes, because the more anchors you have, the more interdependence you will have on all your Bezier curves. So it will make it tricky for you to really make it smooth. And the second thing is that with all of these points, it's very difficult afterwards to reshape. So say that I want to have my axon here being longer, and I want to pull out something. If I have many points in between, it is actually very difficult to adjust that. So that tool I would suggest you don't use. So you should focus instead on the pen tool up here. The pen tool was the one I showed you yesterday, and this is the one where you generate your Bezier curves. And as you remember from yesterday, a Bezier curve has a point and two vectors that are 180 degrees from each other. And these vectors are showing the derived slope at this specific point. So where do I need to put these anchors to make a complete drawing? And anchors need to be in a place where your shape is changing from a convex to a concave shape. So anywhere where you have, this would be called a sign shift if you think about your derivative from a slope. As soon as you have that shift, you need to put a point. So where does that mean in this case? So you have one, so here you are going at the top of a shape, and then you are here changing from one to another one. So this is a point where you want to put the next one. And then you're changing here from a curvature to a flat line, so you want one there. And here you're changing again flat to curve. And here you're changing from one to another curvature. So there should be one. And one here, one here, one there, one here, and one here. So by learning how to see this on a shape, you can already from the start almost exactly define the right number of points. So if I see here, now I've made my first one too long, so I'll just start this in a better way. So I start with a shorter. And the length of these is just you have to learn by doing. So you see the length of these handles, I have to adjust them based on the length of the curvature, the softness of the curve in between. And then the next one I put down here, and then you see that that has a sharper curve, meaning I have to pull it out a little bit more. And then I have the next one coming here, that could be rather short. Going here it changes curvature, next one going up here, and that's a rather sharp curve. The next one, and then you can go there and adjust that one. And you see sometimes you cannot manage from the start, but don't bother with that. Just continue drawing. And then you'll go the next one here, the next one there, like so, and then here. And at the top of this part is almost like a circle. And as you know, from a circle you can get around with only having 4 anchors. So there should be enough to only have one on this side. And then you go back to this guy here. So now when you see it, you have something that is pretty close to what you wanted to have. And if we get rid of this bottom one, it is rather soft, but of course not perfect. And this is the great thing with Illustrator, that now you can then go in and say that this part I did not do very well with. So I can press the V button to get back to the black arrow, but actually what I want is the white arrow here, which is the direct selection tool. And the direct selection tool is now when you want to start fine-tuning your design here. So then I go to this point where I was not happy with, and I can move those specific anchors. And sometimes you see that it sort of sticks to where it was before, and then you may have to move it out. And in this case, where I did not succeed was the length of this first anchor. So then I can go and pull that anchor out to fine-tune this to that shape. So have you managed to get this drawing down? Anybody? No? It's the internet is not working very well. But I guess you can get this feeling to draw something yourself on the computer just to learn how these anchors work. So it is just one of those things that you with time you get more and more efficient on pulling these handles out enough in the length and understanding how they flow into these soft shapes. But it is then very easy to do this kind of thing, and because I have made this shape in the way I have, I can now easily adjust. So if I want to have this part of the interneuron moved out a bit, I can pull over here, and this is difficult to show on the screen, but so you see in this that you have anchors here, anchors there, and here, and one there. So if I want to extend the axon, I can select only the anchors that are on this side of this synapse. And then I can move this out with the arrow, and I can stretch it out like this. So then you see, because I have rather few points, it stretches well in only the shape where you wanted to extend this. So then I can fine-tune afterwards if I didn't like my drawing or something like else. So you can always do like that you select some parts. I'll just move that back. Or you can do, of course, the opposite, that I can only select the synapse part, and I can drag that out on this side.
Do you use the regular pen, or do you use the one that is called Add Anchor?
No, I use the regular pen. in this case. So the add anchor is once you have done a shape and you want to add things to it. Say that I want to add, in this case, a dendrite coming out. You may want to then add anchor points. And what you then do is you click on your current path and you add new anchor points to it.
Can you add to a current path like extend?
Yes, so you can do it in two ways. One is, of course, that you can start adding points here and here, and then pull out the things in between. But that can be quite tedious way of doing it. So I would do it either of two other ways. The one is to use the pathfinder, that you add another extension and you unite the two. That makes the cleanest version.
And I mean, for something like the medium spiny, do you think it's easiest to do smaller compartments and merge them all together?
Yeah, exactly. I would do these spines, for example. I would do one spine and then copy it and then unite them too. So I would make the basic shape of this medium spiny first and then add the spines on. And other shapes you can start to think about if you can actually use primitives. So if we think about this projection here, these are by purpose done very sort of similar width all the way. And then you can actually start out by making a line in the center of this. So what I try to do here then is to make a line that goes straight and then down like so and up here, not totally bound here by the shape. And when you make something in the center, and in this case I actually want to have one fewer anchors than what I had here, because the one that I have in the bottom there is not actually necessary, because this whole thing is one semicircle. So then you can go in to have the delete anchor point, and I delete the one at the bottom there. And I click on it, and I delete that one. And then I can take these handles and pull them out, and this one. And I can get a little bit different shape, but something that is guaranteed to be smooth. And I'll show you why that can be nice later on. So I move away from my sketch, and that's of course something you should always do when you think that something else looks better. You should not maintain that shape, of course. So now when I've made this center line of this projection, I go into my stroke palette again, and I make it wide enough to be the entire projection out. So in this case it can be 11, and I'll just fine-tune the last anchor here because I see it's not very soft, like so. So now I've made the core of this projection. And then there's a very useful tool. It's called, in the path under object, you can outline your stroke. And so when I do that, you see that this stroke now went from being a line to being the line on the outside of this and nothing in the inside. And you'll see that better if I change it to being white with black lines. So then it's just based on that simple path, you can make a long projection that can be the right shape. And that helps me because now I can generate a second one being from the center here. Sorry, the center there. And being just straight down here. We should have been keeping these guys. So, and making this also 11. And do the same thing, a path outline stroke with the right. Okay. So this is the thing. Sometimes when you have made a stroke and it is a simple shape, it also maintains the stroke inside. So I had to get rid of that. But now they fit perfectly over each other. And this is where I said that when you make complex shapes, having two simple shapes and then using the pathfinder and using unite can then help you to bring together that type of shape. So now you have two projections that you know are parallel all through, have the same thickness. And that's quite difficult to make yourself if you don't do it this way. So it's a quick way to make this type of shape. And then, of course, you can start to play around with the other end of this one and to draw on top of that. And then I would use the pen tool again and go back into this path here. So I can draw along that, then again out like this. On this side, the same thing there. Another one there being long. Like so. And you can make this terminal roughly how you want it. And then again, we would use the pen to mark that and this one, and then go to unite. So you have made the part of it that was difficult, the synapse you made sort of freehand, and the other part we used simple geometric shapes. And there's not very much more to this. You just draw on top of it until you're happy with it. And then, yeah.
In that case where you have looking at the boot on excellent. In the case where the lines don't meet perfectly, after you unite, because you have to like ununite and then use the direct.
Yes. So it actually helped me in this one that the smart guides was snapping to it.
Okay.
So that's why I used that to get a perfect match. But sometimes you don't.
But if you don't, it
Yeah.
has to go back to the direct.
So yes, so that's a bit of a more advanced tool that I would suggest. If you, let me see if I can fake that. So if we have this one being sort of like that, and then we go, this is quite often you get this type of thing, and when you unite, you get a small edge like this. So what I would do is to really zoom into it, take the direct marker, mark this one in between, and take it away. So you make an open wound, and then you actually select one of these anchor points and put it onto the other one. They will snap to each other. And then you mark both of these, right click and say join. And then you have healed it again.
Okay, so even if it has been united, you can...
Yes, you can open it up and put together and heal with the join command.
How to unheal it?
So to separate it again, you can, as I did here, so now it is healed, but you have this part in between that you want to break up. So you use the direct selection tool, and you click only on the line in between those two. And then I press the backspace button. So then I take that line away. It may be more obvious if we think about this in the setting of a circle. Let me just draw a circle here next to it. So if you have a circle where you have 4 points, so you have the 4 points at the top and the sides and the bottom, and you can delete one semicircle here and to get it up. And this is the thing, if I want to make a pie chart, I may not always have one that is a quarter. So I may want to start taking away smaller parts of the circumference here. So then it's again good to use the add anchor points. So I can add 2 of these there, and then I can select the part in between and take away that. So then I open it up as a smaller. So you can always add more anchor points at any time, or you can delete anchor points. And deleting anchor points will always have the risk of changing how things look. Because if I have an anchor point that is required to maintain this shape, and I delete that anchor point, like this one, it of course changes how the shape looks. So deleting anchor points can change the shape, while adding will never change the shape. They will be put in place and just continue with the same shape. Yeah?
I only get one. I don't get the You get two going out, so you can bend it like that. I only get straight. I only get one. So you have time later.
Yeah, so this can be dependent on how you draw the one from the start. And you can change that in the same tool. It's called in the pen tool, there is a convert anchor point tool. So if you use that on the point where you only have one anchor and pull out, you should be able to get two. But we can look at that specifically later on as well. So these are the basic tools to get started drawing an image. And then I thought I can go into some parts of fine-tuning this a little bit more. So then we have the next version of this, if I just sort of shown here, when I've traced out all of these things. So in this example, what you have is ends that do not look very attractive. So you see here that you have this one being sort of with a sharp end here, sharp end there. So I wanted to give you some tips on how you can make nice transitions out of this. So if we focus on this axon going in, and we want to change this end, what I can start doing is, again, to select the part in between there, or actually in this case we can delete those two. So we get an open end. And having this open end looks a little bit better than a closed one. So that's first step. But the next step is that it's not so nice that the lines go out straight. And this is another tool that is rather new in Illustrator, and I've been using it more and more. And it's this small tool here. It looks a bit like a C elegans. And I think the first thing I always draw when I show how this works is actually a C elegans. So what you can do is to make a shape that may be sort of inspired by, say, a small C elegans like this, if you have a good imagination. And you make this really thick for you to see that well. So now we have a line with the same width all the way. But this line width tool, you can use it at any of your anchor points, or actually add more points in between. So at the end anchor point here, when I press there and click, I can change the width of the path at that point. So I can make it more narrow there, and I can then make this thicker at the center and make it disappear again here. So then you have made your own mini C elegans here. And what the beauty of doing it this way is that this is still just a single path. So you can change the twist of the head here just by changing the path as you would beforehand. And you can change the overall width of this by selecting it and changing the width here. And you see that it's now changing it relative to what you did before. So you can now feed your C elegans, or you can then starve it. So you can make all of these differences there. So that tool can be, yes?
Can you do that in another way? I mean, if you have like a straight a line where you have three anchor points, can you like increase the stroke in the middle, for example, and have, I mean, just as you do here, in the middle, but not. Or is it only with this tool you can do this?
No, you can actually also have predefined profiles. So you see, this is the one profile you would use. And then there are other predefined profiles that look like this. So the one I had was that profile, but it's generated in the exact same way. But it is, you have actually a shortcut to that type of profile that I did, this one, because it's such a useful cigar profile. And then you have another type of profile is this, that gives you more thickness towards the head. So you can use those width profiles, of course, as well. And you can flip them around, I guess. I need to select this one, like so. A third version you can do, and the way you did earlier on, was to outline the stroke and then adjust it. But then it's not as flexible. This one is much easier to play around with.
And if you save your because if you save this as a profile, does that just like save the number of like the relation of the anchor points to the ends of the line?
It's a good question. It should be possible to add to a profile, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I just like did a random one.
Yeah.
Add profile, but I'm just wondering, like, what does it add? Does it add like? Because you know,
Yeah.
cause when you create these with anchor points, they're not actually anchor points of the object per se.
Yeah.
So does it just?
It has to be related to the distance, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So you see the one that is symmetrical has one in the center of the line, and then there's one that is more skewed towards one side. So it is relative to, if you extend it, it should be longer as well. And you can have this type of shape as well. So that is a flexible tool that can make your lines look nicer when you want it to disappear here. So what I thought here one can do is just to make sure that your lines sort of disappear towards nothing in the end. Okay, that was interesting. And let's see. You have to actually specify where it should not disappear as well. So we want to get that out there. Get this one out. So, and then get this to disappear. Sometimes this is not easy to get right. Okay, so now we have made something that almost looked like what I was planning to do. Let's just correct this last version here. This is why it's good with the zoom tool, so you can go in and like so. Okay, so now the lines themselves have started to disappear at this side. But how can we then do so that also the filling of this disappears? And this is another tool that goes into some more advanced transparency. And this transparency that I want to use here is then called opacity mask. So when I select the object like this, you can go into the transparency. And this one becomes a little bit complicated. So you need to follow these steps. So you see you have the object here, and then it has something here that is a mask. And what is the mask? It is a region that defines what it should be shown of this object. So if I make a mask of this object, you will see that the whole object disappears. You see only the outline of it there. And this is because there's no mask in there describing what should be shown. And when I draw in there, I can now make a rectangle. Say that I draw one here. Sorry, it should be marked. So this one needs to be marked for the object. And then when you draw the rectangle, you see the object showing through only at that place. And then you can move this rectangle around. And this has some very nice features. And what it means is that you can actually, in there, play around with gradients. And gradients are colors that are smoothly going from one gradient to one color to another one. And those gradients, if we go back to the normal and we make a square, those gradients are made with the gradient tool, which makes sense. And so you can have multiple types of gradients. The one we want to use today is the linear gradient. So in this case, we want it to go from black to white, and with a soft change from that. So in here, you have one end, which is the white side here, and the other one here is gray. So when you take the white one, you can then make that into black in our case, and the other one here, you double click and you make this into white. So now we have a soft transition of the filling that is from black to white. And sorry, it was this one I wanted to make clear. So why do I want something like this? Well, if you think that I put it as a mask over this other one, it will then show everything here will be 100% shown, and everything here will be shown 0%. So we can then make a transparency that is smooth going from total visible to totally disappearing. So I cut this box and I mark this object again and go into the transparency mask, and there I place this box in. And then I should take this away and put that box in there. Interesting. Why did this not work? It is there. Oh. Okay, now I need to just think about why it isn't showing the way it should. That was tricky. This is the issue here, because it may not actually put it in the right place. Sorry about that. So we're selecting the run, and then I make the same box, and I make sure that I do the gradient in there. This was tricky, sorry about that. Yes, so now it is working. So what I have now is I'm doing this linear gradient, which goes from black to white, and it is a box. So the only thing that is inside here is this gradient box, like so. So now you can see that you can make this disappear at one end and totally visible at the other end. And this is difficult to show because it is only shown in this opacity mask. So you see in there's now been put this gradient. If I press my Alt Option button, you can then see this box. So that box is in there. So this is something you just have to play around with, but I wanted to show this as an example of what you can use to make this part disappear. And the great advantage of doing it that way, you can probably figure out a number of other ways where you can make this work. The great advantage with this is that when you put something like this behind it, so if I send back, you see that it actually is not just putting some white or some other things, it's only making it transparent in the regions where you want it to be transparent. So although this gradient was this huge box around, it's only applying it to the object that is inside there. And it's still an object that is very fluid. So I can still change every aspect of this object, and it maintains that transparency map. So you only need to do it once. And then for each object you can maintain it like that. So this you can then do, in this case I think I did it then to all of these different terminals, just so that you can make them disappear and make them less sort of invasive in the figure. So they look like they are just disappearing out in thin air. And then in the end, just to show you what I did with these guys, was to put on some receptors and then some intercellular pathways that I wanted to describe. So this was a very sort of quick overview on how to generate a simple illustration in InDesign.
I was wondering, when you do that gradient tool on one side, if
Yes.
you want to, when you had like that blue as a background,
Yeah.
if you want to make the blue background for everything, do you need to make individual squares because you have corners? You know,
Yes.
Like, do you need to make individual squares and then draw a full square in the middle that's a solid color, or?
No, so in this, what I have done is just to. So you're thinking about that I have different gradients for each of these.
The gradient direction is different.
Yeah.
But if you had like a blue background, just like
So
the
it,
last example you did.
yeah, exactly. So if I have a blue background like this, so
okay, so you just actually change.
so what I've done in each of these objects, they have its own gradient in it. So you see this gradient actually looks like that. So it has a little bit different direction.
That gradient, okay.
So each of these objects have their own internal gradient. So it becomes a true transparency in the end that you can make one background behind it. So that was when you want to draw illustration from scratch. Next part, and we have 25 minutes now, and we'll continue then after lunch. Yes?
Because I actually don't even have this option mask in my computer. How to actually get this option?
In the transparency, this. That is a good question. So if you select an object, you do not have
No,
this.
but it's in the option, the drop down at the top right, there's make mask. Because initially there is no.
Okay, so
you need to make new masks.
let's see if I can mimic that. So you mean if you have a new object here, I actually still have it.
Yeah, well, because on my CS5 that mask isn't there. So
Now, okay, so then you need to go in here and make the opacity mask. Can you do that in your? So then when you do that, then this one should appear. And then in there you can then do again this box with a gradient inside. And we should be able to do. So then drawing that box and a gradient to it. Yeah, like so. So if you don't have the make mask, you can take it from the drop down. So the next thing I wanted to focus on is how to bring in data from different analysis equipment. And to be able to do that, I need to explain to you two key principles in Illustrator that were previously used a lot, but nowadays you have so many better tools that you don't use them yourself, but you need to understand them to understand how to clean up your PDF files. So if I write not in the mask here, sorry about that. Here, if I just take away this and I write a normal letter B, and so if you think about this letter and how this is drawn in the shape, you see that there is an outline, but then somehow this shape knows that there should be holes here and here. And how can you actually know how two shapes fit together? And this is called a compound path. So when I'm trying to explain this, let's see if I can do that well. That when you have one path like this star, of course it's easy to know where the filling should be and where the outside should be. But then if I put a circle here and I want to make this circle stand out of the other one, what Illustrator does is that it links the two together. And this linking is called the compound path. So if I make this circle a little bit larger so that it also sticks out like this, and I change the color of that one. So when you select those two and go to Object and you have Compound Path and you make a compound path, it takes the two of them and it looks at the difference. So you have the bottom one being filled, the top one of that being punched out of the bottom, and if there isn't anything below, it makes the dark there. So you see the part outside the star is then black again. So this is actually, you see things through it, if I would make this blue. So you see that it is really holes in this. But the compound path is very much like a grouping. So if I double click on this, I can then, I can move this circle like so. And it's changing how this appearance looks. So you see that moving that circle around in it changes the whole appearance. And this thing is used a lot in type. So every A, B, and O and other typesets have this compound path in it. But it's also very much used when software creates their output as PDF. So that's why I wanted to show you this compound path, so that you can make these overlays, but you can also disrupt them. So in this case, I can go in again in the compound path and release it. And in the other case of the B, if I just make the outlines of this B, so we see now exactly how this shape looks. And then we can go to compound path and release that. And then it takes away the inner part of this B. So then you can move those out. So you see, it's the B is just those three shapes together working as a compound path. And that I'll get back to later on why this is important to understand. The other tool in Illustrator is called clipping mask. So if I have now again this circle and I put this on top of the star and I make a clipping mask. So again, Illustrator works in this hierarchy. So the top thing takes over the bottom one. So if you select these two and then go into Object and you go to Clipping Mask and Make, you have actually then masked the star with the circle. So it's only the part of the star that is inside the circle that is shown. But the whole star is still there. So you see here that when I hover over it, you have the star inside, and if I double click, I can then again move the star inside the circle, and it's still only shown the part that is in the circle itself. So this is very different compared to the Pathfinder, where you can of course exclude things based on shapes, but then it's actually changing the shape. So a clipping mask doesn't change any of the underlying illustrations. It's just changing how it's viewed. So clipping masks and compound paths are very much part of the PDFs that you will bring into Illustrator. So it's one of those, or two things that you need to do when you clean up illustrations or PDFs that come from other software. And that's why you need to know these two. Not that you would necessarily use them yourself. So for this example, I wanted to bring in a couple of examples. So one is a place where you have vector-based data, but you would think that maybe this data can only be exported as pixel-based graphics. And so in this case, I'll show you an example that would be in Windows. So this is just to show you a universal, let's see, continue. A universal software that we use a lot is from our PCR machines, but it can be from anything else as well. And so when you open data and you have results in those software, where you often start is to look on how you can export the image. That's of course the natural thing when you have some data in there. Let's see. This was apparently a big file. So as I mentioned yesterday, when the people write this software, they don't always have export in mind and spend a lot of time on these things. So, but if you see this type of data, what you have in all of these paths is of course data points of fluorescence intensity at different time points, and they are plotted out. So this is a perfect thing if you want to export this as a vector-based graphics. But when you right-click on this and you say Save Image As, which is the way you save these images, you can specify the resolution. And already there, you realize that this is a problem because vector-based images don't have a resolution. So if you need to specify a resolution, that means that it's making a render of this into a pixel-based graphics. So if I say OK there and say Select, you see those file formats you can choose here are only the pixel-based file formats. PNG, JPEGs, TIFFs, and some other two formats, TIFF and BMP format. And so if I save in TIFF, which should be the best version here, and just save this as the qPCR, and save that. What we have done now is to generate a a file, which is here, that is just a pixel-based representation. So it looks okay when you have it zoomed out, but when you zoom in, you see that all of these lines are just pixels. So if I wanted to do any adjustment on this file, it would be quite a nightmare. I couldn't get rid of the grid in the background, I couldn't easily change coloring, and if I want to take away some traces, I could not do that. So it's very sort of locked in its look like it is right now. So what if you can actually generate this as a PDF? And there is a way to do that. And the way you want to use is that you have the ability in this software to print. So when the software prints, it uses a much more intelligent algorithm that sends all the original data to the printer to make the printer print it smoothly. So there you have all this ability to send it to different printers. And then we have now the option that we could actually say that, well, we can make a virtual printer. And the virtual printer can be either from the Acrobat Pro. So on your own Windows computer now, when you install the Acrobat Pro, you can actually have a PDF printer in there. But there may be a lot of your equipment computers where you do not have Acrobat Pro. And there it's a tool called Primo PDF, which is completely free. And it is one of those that actually has rather little crapware in it, so you can survive with having it on many computers. And it doesn't have all of these search toolbars and things. So let's just see if the Wi-Fi is fast enough here. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just download. So you can download this for free. And it also was in the Windows folder that you guys that have Windows, you should also have this Primo PDF file lying in that folder. So this is very useful to put on all the equipment computers. I always do that. So you have this option available within every software you have. Sorry, the Wi-Fi is rather slow here today, but this is not a very big file, so I think I can run this one here. So what this does is that it's just taking this PostScript format, as I talked about, the language that the printers are speaking, and it's taking that and converting it into a PDF file. So it's a very simple way it is doing, but in the end it's very powerful. And the same thing is built in on the Mac OS. So while this is downloading, I can show you the same thing in a Mac OS application. So if we just take the example of a web page, maybe not the best example because the net is so slow. Yeah, so just have any random web page. You can then go in and say that I want to print this one. And you can then say that I want to print this as a PDF. And then down here you have save as PDF. So that's really the lifesaver for getting all of these things out of software that cannot save as Illustrator format. So when I then take this PDF file, you can see that I can then open this in Illustrator. It was a multiple page, so I just want to open the first one. And you see that all of these parts are now objects. So you can go in and take parts of this and you can modify it, move text, and you can play around with that. So it keeps a lot of this ability to edit. And web pages, of course, don't always look very nice when they're printed, and it's the same thing here, that the layout may flow around a little bit, but it's still editable. And in the case of, oh, this is very slow now. But in the case of your measurement data, it's worth spending some time to clean this up. And I wish I could have gotten this. I should have downloaded this before, so about that. Let's see if I have it on my Mac. No, I do not have downloaded that before. Let me see if I can I'll move things around a little bit. So we'll get back to this example. Just keep in mind how that file looked. Yeah.
For example, SPSS graphical.
Yes. Yeah.
Almost the same procedure that
No, I'll show you SPSS now. So SPSS is another one of those, but where we are a little bit more lucky. So if we go to SPSS, let me take here the data set, and we should have this one. So this doesn't matter which version you have of SPSS. I think at least back to 17 or something like that, it worked well. So SPSS I have found to be actually my preferred graph drawing software. And so if we just do so that we generate here a scatter graph where we have a time variable, measurement variable, and a grouping, a very sort of simple version, mean, SEM of 1, and say OK. So we generate this type of graph, and just maybe some lines on it. So you have something where you think looks roughly okay in SPSS, but it may not be perfect. And I wouldn't spend too much time in SPSS fine-tuning this. It's much better that you bring it into Illustrator and clean it up. So in SPSS, you can right-click on it and say Export. And right away in Export, you see that you have two different options here. You can save the graphics, and you can save it as this encapsulated postscript. And as we talked about yesterday, this is a format that can maintain vector graphics and pixel-based graphics. The other four here are pixel-based, so you won't avoid these. So we have there the option of encapsulated postscript. But also you can say that you want to export the whole document as PDF. So PDF is also a good option. So in this case, you now have one of the two choices. Should I go with a PDF or should I go with the EPS file? And this you will see in many software that are aware of vector graphics, that you can export either EPS or PDF. The annoying thing that there is not a single right answer. So in some software it's much better to go with the EPS, and in other software it's better to go with the PDF. In the case of the SPSS, it is the better to go with EPS files. And the reason has to do with the fonts. So if I choose to have, say here, that I want to export graphics only and EPS, and I choose where I should save this, which can then again be in the desktop. Here, so we just say SPSS. The thing you have to think about with EPS files is that you do not have fonts included in there. So here it says, do I want to use a font reference here or replace fonts with curves? And in this case, of course, you want to use it with a font reference. And then we say OK. So now we have generated an output file that is the EPS of this graph. And we have it here on the desktop, and there we are. So now when we go into Illustrator, you see that it does not find that font. So it puts another font in, which is roughly the same. So it may change a little bit the appearance of your text. But the good thing is at least that the text is editable. So now we have everything in here that is editable as objects. And I'll get back to this file later on today also, because this we can use to make into something nice in our illustration. But just to show you here, this is now grouped together. So everything is working together, and you need to start ungrouping this. So you ungroup until you cannot ungroup anymore, and then you also look at this compound path, and you see that you can release that compound path. So now we have a lot of objects here, and you see that some objects are not even visible. You have some of them being white, but in many of these documents you may even have shapes that are without any filling or without any line. And that comes out often when you export to PDF. And why these things are is that the software maintains sort of a structure. You may sometimes have a footer where it says the date or something else, but if you have chosen not to show that date in the footer, it still maintains a box saying that in here there could be a date for the footer. And this is an empty box. And some software like the SPSS in EPS does this rather cleanly. There are not many of these boxes. But I'll show you if you import a page from a journal article, you will see a lot of these extra empty boxes because they have so many templates and things how they are generated that they have a lot of objects that you don't see. And there's a very good tool for that is in the objects. So if I select all of these, they have been ungrouped, and I select them in object, you have path and clean up. So when you select that, you can delete all of them that have unpainted objects, empty text paths, and stray points. All of these you can get rid of. And I think now my no cleanup was necessary in this, so this is very cleanly done. Now I'll just go in and quickly install this Primo PDF, so I can show you that.
Sorry, what you did with the SPSS file when you imported this? You took ungroup and then you did something else?
Yes, and then I released the compound path. So it has made this compound path of many things within inside that object. So that can, that's why I showed the compound path and clipping masks, that they are often done inside these PDFs. So for you to be able to edit that, you need to be able to release these compound paths. So now we have a new printer. So when I go to the print dialog here, I now have a printer called the Primo PDF. And the only thing I need to do then is to say that I want to print to this Primo PDF. And then it comes up with this dialog to ask me how I want to make this PDF. And the best one is to use the pre-press version. It gives you the highest quality of this version. And then I create a PDF. I do nothing afterwards. And save this PDF to the desktop. So then we call this QPCR2. So now we have generated a PDF in a software that doesn't know about PDFs. So it can't generate PDFs itself. But still, when you look at this same file and you compare the two, you see that the text in it looks smooth, and you have all of these paths being perfectly smooth in the export. And that gives you this great advantage that you can now go into InDesign and again look at the output. And this is now showing another issue that you may have, and that is that fonts, if you move them from one of these proprietary software, they may use their own fonts in this PDF document. And as I mentioned before, PDFs can contain typesets, but those typesets are not available when you want to edit. So when you want to edit in Illustrator, you can actually not use that typeset yourself. And then there is a way around this that I'll get back to in a little bit later setting, because I think you will not remember it now. But there is a way to actually recover all of these, the type in here. But for now, you can just know that that can be possible to rescue. And the rest of all the data is in here. So now we can select all of this and do this again, looking at if there's clipping or compound mask. There is not. So we can now clean up here, saying I don't want this frame, I don't like this frame here, and I may actually want to make all of these guys a little bit lighter. So just quickly doing something like this would not have been possible to do if you had it only as a TIFF file. So you see that you can make all of these nice changes. Of course, you can then go in also to change width of all its traces. So that's a universal way to try. If there's no saving as EPS or PDF in your software, use a software like this Primo PDF or the Acrobat to print to a PDF. And then you'll be in a much better starting situation to clean them up and make them for your communication.
Thomas,
Yes?
can you please remind how do you clean up?
Yeah. So cleaning up is this way of selecting all of it and going to Path, Clean Up. And then you can get rid of all this stray point, unpainted. But in this case also, of course, it was clean. So I think it's now time for lunch. And then after lunch, we'll continue a little bit on this path. And then after that, Ludwig will come after one. And then after that, we'll finish off with a little bit more of this. And then we'll have a short movie in the end. Okay, great. Thanks.